Well, good morning. I'm Albert Culbreath, research plant pathologist, University of Georgia, here on the Tifton campus. I've been here a little over 35 years now. Like to visit with you this morning on some of our work, focusing on the beginning of the season and the end of the season with regard to leaf spot management. And of course, anytime you talk about the early season part of the peanut growth, you have to consider tomato spotted wilt virus. One of the things I'll point out to begin with a lot of our trials looking at fungicide efficacy or screening for resistance to the leaf spot pathogens, one of the things I've tried to do down through the years is figure out how to do everything wrong in terms of leaf spot management, and this is a plot where we pretty much accomplished that. And one of the things that we've found down through the years is that if we can plant late enough, usually late May to early June, we can maximize the leaf spot epidemics, where we can make sure that we have pressure to separate out the treatments that we're looking at and such. In considering the peanut planting window, over the last few years, our season has been expanding. We've been moving more and more back to early season planting on the early side of things, and for various reasons, including some later maturing varieties such as Georgia 12Y, weather delays, drought during the middle of the season where we have to wait longer to mature the crop. So our season has been expanding. One of the things I wanted to mention is once upon a time, a long time ago, most of our Georgia peanuts were planted in April. A lot of the old growers talked about the darkening nights of April was the optimum time to do that. When I started in Georgia in 1989, there were still a few areas where peanuts were planted in March. I'm not aware of any that's doing that now, but tomato spotted wilt virus dramatically changed that. We found that with the more susceptible and then eventually moderately resistant varieties, targeting in the middle of May for an optimum planting date was a key part of our management for that. As we got better and better resistance to tomato spotted wilt, we've had more and more ability to move back into earlier May, April planting. Like I said, I'm not aware of any March plantings, but we have re-expanded back into April for the planting dates. The better field resistance to tomato spotted wilt has been key to that. And one of the things with regard to tomato spotted wilt and leaf spot, the relative risk of those is almost diametrically opposed. If we look at the tomato spotted wilt peanut RX ratings for early, the risk of planting before May 1st for tomato spotted wilt virus, that's the highest risk, and for leaf spot, and that would include both early and late leaf spot, that's our lowest risk. The risk for losses to spotted wilt goes up as planting date gets later, and we have a down and up movement with that middle part of May being optimum for managing spotted wilt. So anything that we do to try to take advantage of planting date for managing one disease, we have to consider for the other. But again, with the release of better and better resistance to tomato spotted wilt virus, we started rethinking about using earlier planting dates to help manage the leaf spot disease. This is a slide from work from Brian Jordan during his master's work with me a few years back. We were looking at the effective planting date on this is the final leaf spot severity with a Florida 1 to 10 scale, where 10 is completely dead and 1 is no spots. 4, we have considerable spots but not much defoliation, up through better than 9 is quite severe, not quite as bad as that first slide that I showed, but still bad enough. And 06G versus 12Y. One of the reasons we're making this comparison with the much better field resistance to tomato spotted wilt virus that 12Y has, would that give us ample control of tomato spotted wilt that we can take advantage of planting date? And that was what was the case. The planting date effects were similar for the leaf spot on the two varieties. The tomato spotted wilt virus was much lower in the 12Y, especially in those earlier planting dates. So we had indications that we could take advantage of that. In another year, even more extreme effects of planting date. Planting earlier in April, if we planted before the 1st of May, we had almost no leaf spot. It's at the end of the season, even without any fungicide applications. That was an extreme year. We don't see that every year, and I certainly wouldn't count on it. The one thing I will point out was a lot of Brian's objective there was geared toward practices that we might recommend for an organic production situation. But the same thing would apply for conventional as well as organic. If we can sustain our management of spotted wilt with a variety with a high enough resistance, we should be able to take advantage of the early planting date in leaf spot management. With that in mind, my current student, Alana Atkinson, wanted to see if we could delay fungicide applications with an earlier planting date compared to a standard planting date. And for her work over the last couple of years, she did this in 2023 and 2024. She used that early planting date of May the 5th and a late planting date of June the 1st. Of course, we included a non-treated check. We were doing this on Georgia 12Y and Georgia 16HO. Georgia 12Y at least 2 weeks later maturity than the 16HO, so we did add an additional spray at the end of that. But looking at full season applications, and for her work, again, one objective was develop management plans that could work for an organic system, but she was using a tank mix combination of cuprous oxide and elemental sulfur, which we'd seen was basically comparable to, or maybe even a little better than, 1.5 pints of a 720 chlorothalonil. So what the fungicide she was using here, I think you could switch back and forth between a Bravo spray or the copper sulfur sprays in terms of the effects. But a full season fungicide regime treatments where you skip the first spray, skip the first 2 sprays, skip the first 3, the first 4 sprays, and then monitor the leaf spot epidemics over time. What she saw was that if we use the early planting date, and this is on Georgia 12Y, we had virtually similar, very similar control of leaf spot at the end of the season, all the way up through skipping 4 sprays. So that allowed us to do that. Whereas if we waited until the 1st of June to plant, we had much more severe leaf spot to where by the time we skipped sprays, we were very much approaching the late season. So again, with that, even on a longer maturity variety, we can take advantage of the leaf spot. We saw a similar trend with Georgia 16HO. In fact, the leaf spot was actually lower at the end of the season. And again, think about we shortened the season by a couple of weeks with that. But we saw a lot more spotted wilt in 16HO than we did in Georgia 12Y. But it tells us, again, if we have enough resistance to tomato spotted wilt virus, put that together in as much of an integrated system, excluding the planting date effect, to put those together, we can cut back on our needs for fungicides for leaf spot control. The one thing that I showed this slide for was planting date, early planting date in most years, I think would also help us dodge any rust epidemic. We don't have rust in every field in every year. But typically, it is a later season regime. I didn't have it as part of a test this year, but I did see that our earlier planted peanuts went without rust, whereas we had rust develop quite severely in some of our later planted peanuts. So just a reminder that we can't just think about leaf spot, we can't just think about spotted wilt with regard to the leaf spot, but the early planting date, based on multiple trials that we've done, as well as just general observation down through the years, the early planting date may allow a delayed initiation of foliar or fungicide sprays. The one thing that Bob Kimmerite had asked Alana about her talk is, can you expect to go, beyond skipping 3 sprays in the season and expect not to have a problem with white mold? And she answered correctly, and the same answer that I'll give you is that we can't go too far on any of our varieties without putting out a white mold fungicide application. So that's something to do, have to keep in mind, but I think in a lot of cases, especially on something like Georgia 12Y, we should be able to skip 2 applications to where our first application would be something that would be geared toward white mold control as well as leaf spot. Again, the early planted date should also reduce the risk of peanut rust, and I do expect rust to be more and more of a problem as time goes by for us in the future. Well, one thing we do have to consider is that planting earlier does increase the risk of spotted wilt and white mold. With a variety like Georgia 12Y, it has our best resistance to white mold, and among the best resistance we have to tomato spotted wilt virus. And I think some of the cultivars coming in the future may be able to help us even more with that. So again, a Georgia 12Y can help us with both of these. The other thing to keep in mind is, with regards to our earlier season risk of tomato spotted wilt virus, an application of 4-8 insecticide should help against tomato spotted wilt, but we don't talk as much about 4-8 thimet having an effect on leaf spot. So an early planting date where we're putting it together with a thimet application might give us a double tool against the leaf spot diseases that might develop. Again, the higher levels of field resistance in tomato spotted wilt, and I should have said this to begin with, Eric, but anytime you see TSW on my slides, it's not tropical spider wort, it is tomato spotted wilt. So the higher levels of resistance to spotted wilt maybe help us better utilize the early planting date for leaf spot management. And I wanted to point out that better resistance is on the horizon from multiple programs. This is a trial we did in 2024. Georgia 12Y, still among the best that we have, but one of the things that really showed great promise for us in our trial this year under very heavy pressure, where 06G was up to almost 40% incidence, but the variety Arnie out of Dr. Tillman's program, very low spotted wilt. It was just a green island in the field there. So I think there's enough resistance in that and some of the other lines coming that we should be able to plant early without, sometimes I think even without worrying about whether we put out 4-8 or not. This is just a genotype test, multiple lines from Dr. Holbrook's program and Dr. Tillman's program, more resistance along the lines of what we were seeing in Arnie. So as our spotted wilt level of resistance increases in our peanut varieties, I think we can move earlier and earlier in our planting dates and still get by with that, take advantage of that. We may, well, again, I think on all of these, we must count on starting our sprays for white mold control, even with the earlier planting dates, but we may be able to skip a spray, 2, sometimes maybe even 3 from a leaf spots wanted to move to the other end of the peanut season. And again, it keeps expanding for one reason or another. Weather-related delays in harvest, late maturing varieties certainly have extended our harvest window. We picked our last plots about the second week of November, and that same time when we were traveling around, there was still a few fields that were in the fields where the peanuts were still in the field. That can greatly affect leaf spot control, especially if storms or wet weather are the reason for the delay. The other thing, that later part of the season, temperatures cool down. If there is moisture and something like a tropical storm is the reason for that, a lot of times we do have extended conditions that are very favorable for leaf spot to develop. So we have to keep that in mind. So one of the things that we've looked at is the end of season fungicide choice and how that would affect leaf spot in a delayed harvest situation. In 2021, we've done this 2020 through 2023, similar tests with some different fungicides, but in all of the tests, the first 4 sprays were the same for all the treatments. It started off with the chlorothalonil elatus, with the intent of keeping white mold out of the picture in all of those. And the chlorothalonil elatus would give us a moderate level of leaf spot control in that early part of the season, to where the last 2 treatments would be the fungicides that we're interested in comparing. So they go out twice in succession at approximately 2-week intervals. In 2021, we used a late planting date to begin with. And in that, the non-treated, and keep in mind that's not non-treated for the whole season, that's just non-treated in the last 2 sprays. So it showed we had extremely high pressure in 2021. The headline plus sulfur was not quite as good as just a chlorothalonil standard, a little better control with a Provosol plus sulfur. But the best thing we had in that test was Provo Silver. Provo Silver does have some phytotoxic effects, so I expect quite a few of the spots that we saw in the early season were what I call Provo spot. And maybe, I don't think all of that was leaf spot. It's sort of hard to tell. But again, in that year, Provo Silver was very noticeably better than anything else in the test as far as that end of season duration, especially this final rating was 27 days after the last spray application. So that's longer than we would hope anyone would have to go, but we do know that type of situation happens. Similar test results from 2023. I would point out that at about the time of this application, we did have a tropical storm in Georgia. Again, we used Georgia 06G and a late planting date, the same fungicides as the first 4 sprays, and the treatments in the last 2. Again, that's what came to South Georgia about the end of August that year. Not quite as high pressure in 2023 as we saw in 2021, but still heavy, especially considering that our non-treated check was sprayed 4 times before we stopped the sprays. Again, keep in mind that this final evaluation was 27 days after the last spray. The chlorothalonil was certainly better than the non-treated. The Provosol plus TEB plus sulfur and the Domark plus chlorothalonil plus sulfur gave better control than the chlorothalonil alone. But the Provo Silver, again, showed up as being the best. We looked at other fungicides as well, used these as good examples, but across all of the last 4 years for that, the Provo Silver has been our best end of the season choice in terms of maintaining leaf spot control. And the one thing I'd point out is, again, you do expect some spots from the Provost Silver alone. But in the end-of-season fungicide choices across multiple years, Provost Silver has been the best of our end-of-season treatments. It seems to have better residual than anything that we've had. We have had some products down through the years that had similar or better residual effects than what we see now with Provost. That was one of the reasons we had looked at Headline plus sulfur a few years ago. I think a Headline application would have been at least as good as what we'd seen with sulfur. The same thing with some of the others that we've lost efficacy to, but we think to a resistance. But again, we haven't seen the slippage with Provost Silver, and it does have the best residual control of anything that we have available right now. Wanted to mention cultivar effect on leaf spot and a delayed harvest. And in 2024, we looked at reduced applications, similar to what Atlanta was doing based on planting date, but we're seeing if we can do that with CB7 and delay fungicide applications. And in this case, we did not invert until 36 days after the last fungicide application. So similar type treatment regimes where we did have a full season chlorothalonil beginning at about 30 days after planting, a non-treated control. We skipped 2, we skipped 3. We went beyond that, but I won't talk about that today because CB7 is going to need substantial white mold control. But what we saw, even in the completely non-treated, at the end of the season, 36 days after the last spray, or 36 days after what would have been the last spray, 149 days after planting, a non-treated plots of CB7 had about 20% defoliation. So there's a lot of spots, very little defoliation in the overall scheme of things. Keep in mind that a 5 on the Florida scale is what we were getting with full season Bravo applications in some of our fungicide trials on 06G and similar varieties. Going to from 7 sprays to 5 sprays to 4 sprays really didn't make that much difference with this variety. This is the first year that we've done this test. We plan to repeat that, but I was really encouraged in terms of what the leaf spot resistance in this variety brings to us in terms of insurance on the end of the season, for one thing, and also ability to cut back on at least the early season fungicide applications. And this is just a side-by-side. This was well before the end of the season with the CB7 compared to the border of Tough Runner 511. Neither of these had any fungicide applied. So just a very striking difference between our most resistant variety to date and our one of our most susceptible ones that we have available. So again, I think that gives us a lot of options. With a better resistance to leaf spot should help reduce the risk of losses to leaf spot if the harvest is delayed, even when planted late. And again, with this test, we did almost everything we knew to do wrong. We planted late, we had very susceptible borders, and it was amazing how well it held up. We do have to consider white mold. That's one thing in Tim Brenneman's plots from this year. The CB7 doesn't bring anything really in terms of white mold resistance, so we've got to manage that. Rhizoctonia limrot's another question mark, and I don't know about peanut rust without that. But from a late leaf spot perspective, it was amazing how well that held up. The one thing I will mention, and a lot of the growers may have had problems with it as well. If you've got the last peanut plot and the test was no bigger than the size of this room at the Blackshank farm, and you leave it in the ground until the middle of November, when you turn it up, what do you think is going to happen to your yield the very first night? I think the deer harvested about a third of our crop the very first night it was turned up. That was the last peanuts on the farm. They had run out of things to eat, and they hit it really hard. We still ended up with about 2 tons per acre on our CB7, but I think the deer harvested a lot of that. I appreciate your attention. Great to be with you this morning, and y'all have a great day. Thank you.